history. So we're lucky today to have Angela Wilkinson, who's the Secretary General of the World Energy Council, and she's going to talk to us about how systems thinking is used in her organisation and some of the challenges that she faces.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So let me start off with a health warning. I'm not a systems thinking expert. I'm just a practitioner, and I run an organisation that has to start thinking about energy systems and large-scale energy systems change. So I've tried to do some homework and reflect on some of the challenges I'm encountering, and I hope this will be a place where you can help me, as opposed to you think you're going to get all the answers from me. So when Gerald asked me would I do something, I wanted to reflect on managing large system scales in outrageous times, and because actually many of the situations I go into are characterized by outrage. You know, they're highly emotional, very loaded, whether those emotions are hyper confidence or whether they are hyper negative around the world's going to end. The challenge in energy is that in energy you don't talk about emotional stuff. You talk about rational stuff. So I'm very interested in how we're trying to now manage what's classically been seen as a technical systems intervention issue, but in a social context, it's a socio-technical system. Energy has people in it, about how this change comes through. And let's see so the World Energy Council is 100 years old. We were formed in the 1923 at a time of the end of empires and the rise of nation states in an era of energy for peace. We were to prevent nations going to war over scarce resources and to bring about a new international era where everybody would coexist and flourish. We are incredibly idealistic, and we remain idealistic, but not naively idealistic. We do believe that the future can be better, otherwise we wouldn't exist to work for it. So this is one way of looking at the last 100 years in energy. And of course, this history would be different if you were in Indonesia or you're in North America, so it's just one way. One way to think about that is we in the last 100 years, we've experienced at least 3 different eras of energy transition. Energy for peace, energy for growth, and now this era of energy for people and planet. And the context has changed. The systems have changed, and this co-evolution between the system and the context is something that we pay attention to all the time, right? So how do we think about making an intervention in a system which is pretty large scale, very embedded, isn't actually, there's no such thing as a world energy system. There are multiple systems. It's a systems of systems challenge. And I think that, so I was just playing with how I could talk to you. I think in the early days, we were in the basis of building an energy industry. And in those days, we would talk about what we would call tame problems. How do you design a system? How do you model it? How do you make it reliable? What's the operating environment? I think when we came through growth, we've gone through diversification energy systems, and this is really difficult conversation still internationally. There is still a challenge that Europe doesn't seem to understand that the rest of the world isn't trying to copy European energy systems and actually has its own trajectory and its own visions of what energy and society looks like. And now we're in this incredible call for action that goes on everywhere, which I've called a leap of scale rather than a leap of faith, because actually we have to make large-scale change happen faster than ever before in a very diversive and contexted context and environment. So this is one of the ways of talking about the compounding crisis that have been impacting across the energy landscape, the energy leadership landscape. However long you want to go back, but whichever of these waves you think you're paying the most attention to. My piece in China recently was, you can't hear the roar of the tsunami if you're focusing on the ripples on the shore. So actually, in many of the conversations around energy and climate, there tends to be a very partial focus on on one or more of these, or none at all, right? And so we have this challenge of how do we develop energy systems that support 10 billion people on a healthy planet in a context which is increasingly characterized by diverse, divisive, and polarised energy interests, but this is a decisive decade for action. So what's this one called? All right, there's a saying in Creative Future. So in background terms, I'm a physicist by training. I did the first climate impact assessment models back in the 1980s. I'm obsessed with energy because energy is such a foundation of modern life. And I was a professor of futures at Oxford for a while, so I tend to flip between institutions, governments, businesses, and civil society action. So one of the things I was thinking about is, in Creative Futures, we say the old system is dying, but the new system can't be born, right? So the old system is dying, and I think for at least the last 70 years, the ecological myth has been emerging as a different way of comprehending our new consciousness around the environment. And so what the World Energy Council tries to get people to do is to think about what have we learned with the past or pasts. You know, history itself can be a singular factual basis written by victors. There are other pasts. And then what are we trying to do in terms of engaging with the future as an opportunity for co-creating the future? You know, this is an opportunity to shape the future, not necessarily control or predict it. So we've learnt from histories that energy is a system, and actually it's a system with people in it. So ultimately it's a socio-technological, ecological system, but that's one way of framing it. And there's no such thing as a world energy system. There's a lot of talk as if there is a global energy transition. We would say there are world energy transitions, multiple happening. Energy transition is a process. Multiple pathways are emerging. And there is a big misunderstanding, common, that net zero is destination, not means. That Paris is not the goal. It's actually a milestone along the way. That climate neutrality is 280 parts per billion volume, not net zero emissions by 2050. And that's a real difficult piece for people to grapple with. Diversity in energy systems has been increasing in terms of the broadest sense. Technologies, geographies, infrastructures, people, skills, capabilities, visions, and accomplishments. In terms of, I'm about to approach our 100th anniversary as the World Energy Council. We convene World Energy Congress every couple of years. Our next convening is in Rotterdam. And the thematic of World Energy Congress is redesigning energy for people and planet. So what are we thinking about? We're thinking about energy is not a standalone system. We're thinking not in terms of redesign as in you control the design, you make the design and then you implement it according to the blueprint or the greeprint. But how do we guide the evolution and emergence of these new systems that are emerging? And how do we do that with a question around the way people come into this conversation? So my last book was called Working with the Principles of Realistic Hope. Because if you get into situations which are nihilistic, the degrees of freedom and action are very, very limited. So how do we come into a space which is incredibly technical in terms of its identity, energy, right? Energy leaders are technical experts. This is a technical conversation. How do I start to make an intervention in that space, which is what does realistic hope actually mean in this space? So you'll see me, if you follow anything, if you read my stuff, you'll see that my advice to Sultan Al-Jaber, the president of the incoming COP28, is the biggest thing he might be able to deliver is realistic hope. Forget about the blueprint, a plan and a negotiation, but if you can actually create an event that actually keeps realistic hope alive, we might have more degrees. Are you stretching or going to?
No, I'm just listening.
You're stretching. Okay, that's fine.
Fascinating.
So this is realistic hope. We looked at I think in the end we started off with a conversation of practitioners who are working on global challenges across the world, and those challenges are different. Some of them were looking at food, some were looking at energy, some were looking at democracy, whatever you want to talk about. And we asked them, how do you make interventions in large systems? And how do you do that have we lost the sense that we can make the world a better place, right? Because this notion that somehow we've lost this possibility of better. And so we drew together these cases, and then we said, what are we learning from all of these about how you keep how do you make realistic hope? How do you do it in practice? And there were 5 principles that came out of these, and one of these is around systems thinking, so I thought it might be of interest. One of the questions you have to ask is diversity, who's in the room, right? And in so many situations, I go into a conversation where people tell me, oh, this is the most diverse convening we've got. Oh, we've got some women in it. Great, right? This is a very male-dominated industry, very male-dominated conversation, very male-dominated policy space, right? But actually, there's a difference between diversity in the room and activating diversity in the room. We talk about dialogue. How do people interact with each other? How do they understand? How do they appreciate the problem space? How do they appreciate the system they're intervening in? How do they do that? They can, at the moment we have, I think the last time we had a look, there was something like, I think the US government said there are now 9,000 different assessments and reports on climate energy systems and interventions. So we are very good at manufacturing lots and lots of assessments and reports and having a conversation about what's right or wrong in those reports, but we're really bad at having a conversation with each other about our understanding of the situations that we're in and how we intervene in those together. Experimentation, this notion that somehow there's this blueprint or greenprint, these technology roadmaps that are being developed, or these big top-down roadmaps that are being proliferated by governments and countries. There's a sense somehow that those are real and they're really going to be implemented. But actually, I come from a different world where implementation means that the implementation process works out what's wrong with the map and makes it real, rather than the roadmap guides the implementation. So there's a terrible habit in policy that policy claims success, but actually what it's succeeded at is that somebody else has managed to turn the plan into a reality. And if they don't, they'll get fired for it, because it's not the plan that's wrong, it's your inability to actually translate it into action. Systems thinking, the context in which they approach problems and solutions. So, this is a question of what is the system, who's in the system, what's the performance of the system, what's the system we're trying to change, what's wrong with the system. So systems thinking is a big part. And I'll come on to the fact that it's systems thinkings as opposed to system thinking. And futures framing, what's the purpose of creating a future together that's different from the past or the present, right? The purposefulness of which we are making this energy transition happen. You can hear that in the discourse about, what's called the so-called global north-south discourse at the moment. That the global north is talking about the end of the world, and the global south is talking about the end of the week. And what is it about how we manage energy transitions that aren't just about a healthy planet, but are about 10 billion better lives? So, systems thinkings. In 2008, after the global financial crisis, I was at Oxford, and we convened a conversation to ask, what is this crisis and what are we learning from it? And what does it tell us about the system, the financial system, and the crisis that's gone wrong? And when we were doing that, we drew together very, very different disciplines. And we had 2 different types of conversation going on simultaneously. One was around, we need to fix the system. How do we fix the financial system? And the other one was around, we need to redesign societies, because actually the system of money or wealth creation or profitability is actually part of the problem, as opposed to we're trying to fix the system so it can keep going. And under fixing the system, tame problem work, we had very much an externalization of the problem. How do we actually develop a new plumbing of the system? And there were people, quantitative modelling, engineering science, economic rationality came into that. On the other side, we had a lot of people who were talking about, actually, this is a super wicked problem. It's got a time piece, it's got a social piece. We have to internalise the problem. We have to recognise that we're part of the problem. We created the financial system, it's operating, and actually the financial system is just a lot of people. It's not a strange thing, it's the interaction between people and what they're trying to do together. So in that place, there were people who were talking about different systems thinking methodologies, critical systems thinking, as Gerald does, or soft systems thinking, or quantitative modelling. There were people who were talking about the shift from normal to post-normal science. I don't know if that means anything to anyone, but it's Funkowitz and Jerry Revette's and Funkowitz work. And we were talking about realistic hope and futures design. Have we lost our confidence as a species of being able to co-create a better future? And how do we bring that in rather than think about just can we fix the past? This is from my scenarios director, who reminds us that one of the important things to think about when you're intervening in trying to think about energy transition and the challenge of the diversity of interests and perspectives is you have to start thinking, you have to remember that the choice, you have to choose the level at which you seek to engage in the system according to and be prepared to navigate the conflict and the dialogue. So this is a process that he's got is are you intervening in action, policy making, contestation, beliefs and values and narratives, and he calls this the ladder of reflection. So sometimes you have to move across these scales, but it's a purposeful design. You can't do it all at once. You've got to start somewhere and work whether you need to go up and down or sideways through this system. So when we're designing, remember, I have 100 countries. I have the most diverse membership base across all parts of the energy system and all parts of the energy transition interest. This is a community, it's not an organisation as a business. And so when they all come in to this problem space, they all come in with a specific place that they're intervening, with a problem that they've defined. And we have to start asking, where are you coming to this conversation, and how does that connect with where somebody else is coming to the conversation? So where we start as systems intervention is by trying to understand what is the system in the room according to the people who are having that conversation, and where are they thinking is the space that they need to make an intervention, and are we able to design a process around that? So there's framing, there's understanding the problem, and then there's how do we intervene in the solutions? And the other place I find the other space we find very interesting is that people seem to have upped the rhetoric on we need collaboration. Collaboration is the answer to everything, but actually forgotten that collaboration is a choice. There are other things you can do rather than collaborate. And then the approach to collaboration has been problematic. So collaboration in energy climate terms in the spaces that we have experienced has largely been framed in terms of how do we get to consensus, and once we have consensus, how can we design the solution? And actually you haven't got time to get to consensus now. So the question, I'm very interested in the work that's going on in critical systems thinking, and also the work by Adam Kahane, which is about how do we stretch collaboration? How do we collaboration with strangers, with people who aren't like us, with the enemy? And actually, how do we cooperate even if we don't agree, right? So this is something that we are experimenting with. We're experimenting with that at Congress. We're not thinking there saying, how do we get everybody onto the same page? We're deliberately opening up an experimentation space to say, how do we stretch collaboration? We have 100 years of experience. We think we convene the most diverse, we connect and convene the most diverse energy leadership and energy transition interests. And we try to forge global common sense, but to do that flexibly. And we have a whole series of tools and approaches that we use to do that. So just if you are interested in looking at, all of these are systemic in some way. There's the world energy scenarios where we try to address the issue that there is something called the political economy in energy. It's not just markets. And I heard once that you can get money out of politics, but you can't get politics out of money. And in energy, you can't get politics or money out of any of it, as far as I can see. So the world energy scenarios are deliberately trying to say, what are the political economy dynamics? And even beyond that now, we're trying to say we have 3 archetype scenarios. We think they're all framed within the economic myth. How do we start to open up archetypes in the ecological myth? And how do we start to relate a conversation between the systems framing and thinking and intervention spaces across those different myths? There's something called the World Energy Trilemma Index in the 1980s. We looked at how do we know whether a policy is good or bad in terms of achieving progress towards energy in those days was called sustainable development. right? How do we have more energy for sustainable development? The Energy Trilemma Index was developed over 3 years through conversations with practitioners and policymakers in about 120 countries about what is a comprehensive, or what is a comprehensible, not just comprehensive. We can make the UN Sustainable Development Goal framework of 275 indicators and not understand anything about what's going on. So how do we make a sufficiently comprehensive but comprehensible framework for diverse energy systems, leaders and countries to keep talking to each other about, are we making good performance or not, and how do we learn with and from each other? So the World Energy Trilemma Index now, the annual global index compares and contrasts performance of 120 countries. Most ministers like to use it to know where they fit in the global ranking. We try to encourage them to use it to have a conversation about what they can learn with and from each other countries, about how do you design policies that have to achieve energy security, affordability and equity, and environmental sustainability. So again, joining different aspects of the system together. Examples of some of the typical types of systems maps or systems thinking you'll get. This is a causal loops diagram that comes from one of the World Energy Scenario conversations in 2019. This was a new framework that we tried to introduce into the World Energy Congress in 2019 as well. It's called Constellations of Disruptions. And it's probably very obvious to you, but I actually have to spend a lot of time trying to help people understand that energy transition is not a technology innovation issue only, that actually it has policy innovation, it's got combinatorial innovation going on, policy, technology, social and financial simultaneously. So how do we start to get people to join the dots between people who are trying to dominate the conversation on innovation? Systems thinking isn't just something that you put as a diagram on paper, it's how you run your interventions. This is from the work that was done by Ariella Helfgott in Adelaide, the Adelaide Transformathon, where she designed a game, which was, she designed a game competition for people to design a game that would actually help them think about how do they make interventions between navigating the economic and ecological myth and balancing the energy trilemma. So this is them using systems thinking in that to actually produce the game that could be used for large-scale engagement of other people. So I'm about to finish. This is where I think I'm navigating, somewhere across this landscape when I'm not going mad. I think I have the economic, the myths that made us. The climate science myth is in there. The religious myth is still live and kicking, and the corruption of the hero myth is massive, but I could talk about that at great length. And we have systemic leadership, which in my experience is polarized between those who think you have to understand the system before you intervene and those who think you have to change the system in order to understand what it is, the difference between inform and make. And we're navigating across this space in terms of we have to engage with the techno-economic modelers who keep telling me they know the ideal tipping point. We have to stretch collaboration and think about the combinatorial innovation. We have to work with nudge experiments because sometimes a small change can make a huge difference. And we also have to navigate this paradigm shift. And in the energy transition discourse, the thing that I'm obsessed with at the moment is that for the last 100 years, I think we have experienced a framing contest between commodify everything and democratize everything. And my challenge is, how do I move that into a sequencing contest, into a sequencing conversation rather than into a polarization conversation? World Energy Congress. Next year in Rotterdam, 7,000 energy leaders, 70 sessions, and I'm into bold experiments. You're the systems thinking work stream of the operations research community. If you've got a bold experiment, I'd love to hear it. Thanks.
So who's got a bold experiment?
Thank you for the presentation of all the problems and complexity, but you didn't recommend any solution, such as the Nobel Prize award is given for solving wicked problems without markets and without state, which is Eleanor Ostrom.
Mm-hmm.
And her solution was bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
All this is depending upon top down, which makes it very complicated. And it doesn't recognise Ashby's problem, a solution, that to control complex organisations, you can't do it directly. You must do it indirectly through supplementary, requisite variety of co-regulators,
Mm-hmm.
which corporations could fulfil that role.
Mm-hmm.
So why haven't you mentioned Ostrom's solution of solving wicked problems without markets and without state?
Okay, there's many things I haven't mentioned, but I would say that my own agenda is humanising energy, and I think that most of our work focuses on how do you think about bottom-up engagement, but you can't ignore top-down engagement or top-down control attempts in this space.
But
Markets
Ashby says it's impossible. It's impossible to regulate variety from the top down. You've got to be bottom up.
I'm not saying that, I'm not denying that. I'm just saying I have a space where I have to intervene and try and make it work, knowing that there are people who would disagree with that view. And my job is to open a space where we can have experimentation and engage more bottom up. And that's what we try and do. So Ashby's law of requisite variety, huge respect for that. Eleanor Ostrom's work around the governance of the commons and the different ways of doing it. I've got a huge respect for that. And the question for me is, how do I create experimentation around that and get people to want to do it and open that space in a very constrained, technocratic, very top-down space? So that's what we try and do.
I suggest that tax incentives to turn corporations into a common fuel resource would be a better experiment.
Okay. I don't have any regulatory authority or any power. I can convene and have a conversation about how that might look, but I can't insist people do it. I don't prescribe.
Yeah, so as far as bold experiments, I mean, I can talk about something happening on a very local level that my student Matt Giancola is involved in, and he's actively working on writing up his findings for his dissertation, which is why he's not here. But he's working in New Orleans with the looking at and working with managers of farmers markets in Louisiana, which is a very interesting. Louisiana is sort of the canary in the coal mine when it comes to climate change,
right?
Because they've had more hurricanes, more disaster, and you talk about emotion as well as intellect, and when Mac's been doing interviews for his dissertation, and when he's asked people to think about 2050, they start crying.
Oh.
And he started crying because New Orleans is probably going to be underwater. So it affects the whole the food system in the whole of the state. But I was wondering if you were familiar with it. So he and I were impressed with the Three Horizons framework of Bill Sharp.
Mm-hmm.
I guess there's different Three Horizons. It's not McKinsey Three Horizons, it's Bill Sharp's.
I know Bill.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so Mac's been using that framework to frame the interviews and observations he's been doing, and I think it does sync up nicely with some of what you've said. I mean, the idea that thinking of the second horizon as the transition state. So it's not just about visualizing where we ultimately want to get to, but how can we develop relationships, like you said, stretch collaboration that are going to make that make the whole possible.
Yeah, so Bill's work on Kairos and Chronos, which gives you the Three Horizons work, basically is very much inside the framework of the Oxford Scenarios Planning approach. So that's the school that actually we take our plausibility scenarios from. I'm one of the co-authors of that methodology. So one of the other things to think about is we have a partnership with BBC Storyworks where actually we're trying to tell stories of how communities and different localities are actually engaging in the energy transition opportunity rather than distress, and sharing those. And they're beautiful stories. They're They're produced in little 5-minute vignettes. They're not technical. They're in the language of people. They're stories that people can engage with. So again, how do we stop it being so scary and so remote? And how do we sort of get people human-centric stories? So that's something to look at.
Sometimes, people don't necessarily even realize the stories are important. I think because it helps people think about and take to a different level what they're doing and what they're experiencing. Because some of the people involved in the farmers markets, some people do see it as related to climate change. Some people don't. And I've also seen that in Chicago, where some of my colleagues at the Field Museum were doing an interview a few years ago on practices in local communities in Chicago that they saw as addressing climate mitigation, but people didn't necessarily see what they were doing in that framework, like reusing materials, having community gardens, stuff like that. That is action that you can do on a local level that people don't necessarily connect to the local, up to the global challenge, but stories can help you make the connection.
So I gave a meme to people, which is, let's stop talking about global technology moonshots. There's only been 11 men on the moon so far, and an Indian satellite probe going in there. And let's talk about the hundreds of thousands of smaller steps, and let's try and encourage that upswelling.
There's a number of people asking, so they're first, then roll in next.
Thank you, yes. So it was interesting with your World Energy Council. Do you see roles for other organisations? So I was very minded when you said about getting a diverse group of people in the room. I've seen things like the Technical Cooperation Panel did that in the defence area, and similarly the Cornwallis Group spun off the International Symposium on Military Operational Research. But these groups where you will naturally those titles focus on the technical, but it's a way in, and it's how you get people in, and it seems to be a useful part of their day job. Do you have any ideas on what organisations would be able to complement what World Energy Council does? Particularly, is there anything Operational Research Society might focus on?
So the membership base of the World Energy Council is organisations, not individuals. So thousands and thousands of different types of organisations and coalitions of organisations, right? The common agenda is, how do you actually make an energy transition or energy transitions work, which are systems interventions that have this ambition of 10 billion lives on a better planet, right? That's the enduring mission. So, there are each of the, it's a decentralised community that basically is having a conversation across many different types of coordinating mechanisms about what they're learning together. It's an ecology. It's not a single project.
Yeah.
I'm Marlene, and I'm sure you will gather from my accent that I'm South African. And in South Africa, we are running experiments, but not planned, not at all coordinated out of as an absolute desperate. We experience electricity blackouts for 4, 5, 6 hours a day from the government, and we all invested in generators. Luckily, I'm not guilty. My first action was an inverter and the battery. That didn't work. And now in our societies, we are all self-sufficient. We are all a lot of people that can afford it is self-sufficient in terms of solar energy. You can, a year ago, you walked through the neighborhood and you heard one generator after the other. And now a generator is the worst option because you are making such a big mistake with a generator. So you are talking about experiments, and I'm looking at the conference or the congress in Rotterdam and the yellow dots, and I don't see dots from Africa.
No,
I don't see dots from Southern Africa. And you can, sometimes when you want to change policies and inflict change or motivate change, when people are desperate enough to make the change, you find very interesting things. So across my home there's a nursery school that's doing something very interesting. They have a farm, a vegetable garden with shades, but the shades are solar panels. So there are so many interesting things happening out of our desperate situation in South Africa and in Africa. So I would love it to see in the diagram and the map of all the involved parties. Little dots here from the dog continent.
So let me clarify. South Africa was one of the founding members of the World Energy Council.
Yes.
That we have 16 different chapters across the Africa landscape, north, south, east and west, that are the South Africa member committee collapsed 2 years ago because they couldn't manage their finances. We have been actively engaging to rebuild that. We still draw the learning from South Africa. All this map shows is that South Africa itself hasn't hosted a World Energy Congress. World Energy Congress is it's not a thing I decide. It's a thing decided across the membership about where they want to go because they think the most learning is. So they vote on it. That's the prerogative of all of our members. It's not $1, one vote. It's one constituency, one vote. So I would love to take a World Energy Congress to Africa. It's my big ambition to have one there. I have to find a host that's willing to organise it. You've got to remember I'm taking 70 ministers in. It's like running the Olympics. There's a cost issue to it. There's a security issue to it. But I would love to make it happen. And that is still one of our ambitions as the World Energy Council.
As long as you involve the learning from Africa.
Yeah, so you'll see those in the BBC Storyworks series. You'll also see it in the work that we're doing. We did an outlook of Africa as a whole about 4 years ago.
So I'm aware there's lots of questions. I'm going to come to you next, and then Jenith, and then...
Thank you. Well, you were referring to humanizing electric systems,
Energy.
and also you were referring to these different views
Yeah.
from the global north and the global south. And listening to my colleague from South Africa, what would you say about the purpose of electrical systems in that case? So how is that differences emerge from diverse perspectives on the purpose of electrical systems? I mean, is this a human right? Is this a business opportunity? So what
All of that's in the
electrical systems should be about?
Yeah, so all that's in the conversation, and it varies according to geography as to what they think is the best way of electrifying their societies. So electrification, the electricity revolution started over 100 years ago. It's sort of had a couple of starts since. It was around the promise of atomic energy, life at a press of a button. I think there were great hopes then that was going to be unlimited energy for everybody, for almost like energy as a human right in modern societies. And somewhere along the way, that conversation got less, and the conversation about what I would call the industrialization and the financialization of energy has become much more prominent and dominant. I would love energy to be a human right. It would make my life so much easier in delivering my mission, but my issue at the moment with the electrification conversation, UN SDG 7 and basic energy access, is actually it's a inhuman metric. That we have a metric that we're trying to achieve in basic energy access, which is defined as electrification, and the statistical manipulation around that is absolutely abhorrent. So you can actually qualify for having full basic electrification access if one house in a village somewhere has a electricity panel, a solar panel on their roof, but that doesn't mean that everybody has the energy that they need to life. So modern energy access is becoming a contested metric, and we are contesting that metric.
Oh, thank you so much for your talk. It's really great to hear about the work in such a short, condensed space of time as well. I just wanted to say something about your bold experiments and perhaps also reflect on the complexity of the tasks that we all have. Just from the point of view of having done quite a bit of work recently on water transition, and coming to the conclusion that, particularly from the water point of view, obviously water interpenetrates all the other systems that equally need to be or are in transition. And I mean, we identified some very obvious candidates where sometimes things that are allegedly towards an energy transition are actually damaging the potential transitioning and or sustainability, let's call it, of the water system. So I was just thinking about, so we had to take the view, I think, that actually adding in elements of requisite complexity gives us a bigger solution space.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of way we've been trying to look at it. And consequently, I was just thinking in terms of your international actors that you have and all the different countries and areas and so on, that different areas, if we can talk about co-transitioning perhaps as a sort of framework, we could identify which areas of transition are most vital and important for, I mean, they usually all are, of course, but sometimes they're manifesting themselves more dramatically in one area like food or water,
Right.
than perhaps energy. I mean, they are obviously all related, but I'm just wondering how we can work with this in a really constructive way that we can help get solutions without, you know, the co-transitioning kind of approach.
Yeah, so our narrative would be that we're in an era of grand transitions, not that there's an energy transition happening in a vacuum independent of other transitions around that space. And the trilemma framework that we introduced was the framework to try and get requisite diversity around this, because we have been under huge pressure to limit all environmental metrics to carbon only. And we try and keep forestry, land use and water in that framework. So, you know, I'm just telling you, it's a battle. There are now, because we haven't changed, there are competing metrics. This is a really difficult space to be in, but we have an ambition to continue to evolve the trilemma, not just at the global and the national level, but at the city and the community level, and perhaps at the corporate level, to allow that conversation of learning about how do you connect the dots between these different aspects and what we're learning from it.
But maybe also sort of formal communication with other world bodies that are to do with water and food. And I mean, I'm sure you have that already, but maybe some more systems thinking about how that might happen better, maybe.
Well, if you can help me understand which organisations I should be prioritising my connections with as we partner. I mean, I get asked every day to form a memorandum of understanding with some organisation or another, and I have to say that's great. But if I can't have a memorandum of action and there's no resourcing that goes with it, it just leads to a lot of paper.
Yes, I like very much you were talking of super wicked problems. So I would like to throw in perhaps another one. Have you contemplated in your scenario work what happens if and when, and it's more like when, the global energy systems with an S, without an S, are no longer self-powering? To clarify that, my team, we have a bunch of independent researchers doing thermodynamics on the global industrial system. Our results of late last year, show that, and the data is very strong, that we are getting very close to a situation where the total cost of getting energy comes very close to the total energy we get. If we get to that point, everything stops. Whether you have one system, multiple system, whether diffuse or not, thermodynamics is uncompromising. If the cost of energy, total cost, all resources combined equals to the amount of energy we get, all resources combined, including renewable, everything stops.
Mm-hmm.
The data we get is that at the current rate, so if we slow down, we have a bit more lead time, but at the current rate, the critical horizon is 2030.
Right.
We have a bit of a problem.
I think I understand you, but I'm not sure. So let me clarify. Are you saying that in thermodynamics, the amount of energy we're producing is the amount of there's no extra energy? Is that what you're saying?
The amount of net energy between the gross and the cost is shrinking very rapidly right now.
Right.
People don't see it
Okay.
because they don't look. It's like the famous film, don't look. They don't look essentially because they do economic analysis, financial analysis. If you do thermodynamic analysis, it becomes very visible. And it's very annoying. Are you looking into that, or are you interested in looking into that?
We can always look at. I mean, the part of the community is the whole academic community on the thermodynamics of energy. So, but bring the conversation in. It's an interesting conversation.
I'm running a workshop on that tomorrow.
Okay.
But because your organisation is obviously very critical in the whole system, and you're doing wicked problems.
Well, I think our organisation was very critical in the whole dialogue space and the leadership space. The challenge now is it's very crowded, competitive, and very commercialised, and we are fighting to retain our space, and it's pretty hard. But always open to better ideas and solution and for action. So let's send me something to read and let me see how I can trigger a conversation around it.
Yeah.